The year is 2050. The place, Manchester. All the buildings are net zero carbon, and our communities are as diverse as they are inclusive. There are homes for all, no matter how much you earn. And good business is good action. If that's the future we want, how do we get there? My name is Julia Hatmaker, and I'm the editor of Place Northwest. Today's Place podcast is brought to you by Onward Homes, and we'll be looking at how we deliver the homes of the future. And because the future is so vast, we'll look specifically around what we can be doing in the second half of this decade to ensure that that future vision becomes reality. Joining me today are Manchester City Councillor and Executive Member for Housing and Development, Gavin White, and Sandy Livingstone, Executive Director of Property for Housing Association Onward Homes. Gavin, Sandy, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here, Julia.
You're delighted to look into the future and project how we will actually manage these challenges.
Well, we're going to be looking at that in about 3 different sections. That's how I've divided it. I figured we'd look at a series of different ambitions, the first of which is net zero, then we'll tackle affordability, and conclude with social value. So, buckle up. All right, factor 1, net zero. Manchester City Council wants to be net zero by 2038 and the UK by 2050. Time is ticking if we're going to meet those goals, so there's no time to waste. So within this section, I thought we'd look at 2 key factors, retrofit and brownfield land. Now, retrofit, of course, is talking about making sure that the homes that currently exist today have the adjustments made to them to make them sustainable for the future. So let's start off with retrofit. Sandy, what is Onward doing and what are other housing associations doing to kind of tackle this issue?
What we recognise is both the challenge but the opportunity of net zero. For our customers, it will deliver homes that they can afford but also afford to live in by the time we've retrofitted the houses that they own and changed the heating systems. So for us, personally, we are delivering retrofitting 1,000 homes across the Northwest by 2025. And our plan is to do another 4,000 by the end of the decade. And by doing that, we'll have dealt with the worst possibly performing homes that we've got. But we need to look beyond that, because once we've built up the skills and capacity and taken the opportunity, there's another 5,000 or 6,000 homes that we need to retrofit to make them fit for the 2038 target the council is setting. And I believe that sort of ambitious target will be set by all councils and government in the short term. So scaling up and being ready to go and ready to accelerate the past part of this decade, because if we don't do it then, we're not going to do it.
Gavin?
Yeah, very much so. I think it's a really key thing for us as a city to get to zero carbon by 2038, as you say, Sandy, and it's good to hear how Onward are progressing towards that. And, our wider ambition is to get to, by 2032, 30% of our social housing stock to EPC-B or above, with a view to then getting it all to, zero carbon by 2038. So it is highly ambitious, but I think it's a really important thing for, moral justice, climate justice, but also social justice, that these houses are retrofitted so it's cheaper bills for our residents, it's more affordable, and it improves the value and the investment in that stock for all.
And what I would say in addition to that is that across the Northwest, across Manchester City region, Merseyside and Lancashire, we're working collaboratively with other housing associations at scale. So I think at the moment, if you look at the last round of social housing decarbonisation bids, across the Northwest, about 30,000 homes across the housing association sector. So it's not answering the whole of the challenge, but it's starting to build the scale and volume and the manufacturing supply chain base that will allow us to do this.
And there's a lot of mutual learning going on, isn't there, as different housing providers invest in that stock, retrofit. We're learning from each other about different house types and getting those homes insulated with, triple glazing, air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, the different technologies, and the challenges of then the employment to deliver that on the ground. But there's a lot of co-working going on, which is good.
And it's the opportunity for employment. It's that thing of skills training, delivering that with your communities so that they have access to work now and in the future.
Mm.
So when it comes to retrofit, it's all great to kind of fix insulation, install the air source heat pumps. But one of the things that I find is a big issue with that is making sure that the communities and the people who are living in these buildings know how to use them in a way that really actually hit those sustainability goals. So how do we do that? How do we make sure everyone's on board with how to use their building to the best effect?
Yeah, I think it is a really key part, as you say, Julia, that we work alongside residents. It's new technology, it's a new way of heating your home, and make sure that people have the sort of support with that in the early days, making sure that they've got the technology and awareness and support, but making sure that also that it's take away the fear. Actually, this is to help reduce your bills in the long run. This is about heating your home in a more sustainable way, heating your hot water. So yeah, we've got a pilot project in the area where I live in Southway in South Manchester in the Arrowfield estate, and I know Southway put a lot of money and investment into sort of workers on the ground, energy hubs where people can drop in, get help and support. And that's really vital. We've done that again with our council housing in North Manchester.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. This is about taking the community and your customers with you from the very point of actually conceiving that you're going to do this, and supporting them into the longer term, both in terms of these buildings will operate slightly differently. But it's also useful to remember that in the 1970s we switched from coal gas to natural gas. So we've done this before. We just have to remove the fear factor and educate people on how these systems actually work and how we actually live in the property with them. If we do that and take them with us, and they see the advantage of a warm home and one that has given skills and employment training, I think they will come with us on the journey.
So that's enough of the buildings that we have now. Kind of thinking more to the buildings that we're going to be making in the future. It strikes me that one key way of making sure we build sustainably is to really tackle brownfield and make sure we're building on brownfield first. Building on brownfield land, of course, means that we're building on land that had a previous use. It's not countryside, it's something that's been a property or a development before. So how do we go about making that happen? Gavin, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, in Manchester, you're right, Julia. We've got a lot of brownfield land, and it's land we want to build on for housing. There's a huge housing demand in the city. Manchester's a really popular place to live, which is really good, but we've got to meet that demand with the right kind of housing in the right location. So bringing forward, former industrial land that needs cleaning up, that's decontaminated to make it safe, is a vital part of our housing strategy. So obviously we work alongside landowners and developers and also government and GMCA about getting brownfield land funding to clean up those sites, to get them ready for development and to bring that forward. And a good example of that is just down the road in Victoria North, from the back of Victoria Railway Station, bringing forward some really derelict, contaminated land for housing, for new schools, and we really need that housing. So yeah, we're really supportive of that, and welcome the recent announcements that GMCA is going to get more devolution of brownfield land funding to help deliver more housing in Greater Manchester.
Yeah, I think brownfield land development we see with the changes that are coming in terms of removal of national house building targets across the northwest, that the land that we will access will be brownfield land predominantly. It is at the moment for us and most housing associations. We are used to tackling that type of land. We know how to deal with it, remediate it. We are building up our skill base so that we can tackle even more of that land of that type and control it. But it's backing it with funding. What we need is sustained funding in terms of brownfield land and infrastructure funding, and more strategies like Manchester's coming forward where it's clear. The other great advantage of brownfield land is remembering that's where the transport hubs already exist, so you don't have to create them. They are already there. So if we're looking at reducing carbon and we're increasing biodiversity gain by not building in greenfield land, that's the challenge we need to take on. We also need to get used to building a bit more density and being comfortable building with more density by designing it better, so that when we design it, we think about a mixture of use and property types to house our customers, but we consciously design it for them into the future, so we're not just building it quickly, leaving no amenities, leaving no green space. We build all of that in, create a real sense of community in place as we do that. If we do that, we'll address the challenge.
The thing I really enjoyed about your response right there is that you mentioned that there is an asset to building on brownfield that's beyond just not building on greenfield. You mentioned that they're around transportation hubs. Are there any other good things about brownfield that we should be looking at that makes it a desirable place to build, even though it might have some remediation issues?
It tends to be located, because of the ways our cities have developed, particularly in the northwest, it's located in the middle of communities. Generally, you'll find that cheap biofuel with a factory or a brownfield land site, there will already be a community centre. There will already be housing. So it's located both where the transport links are, but it's also located where communities and facilities are. So we're not trying to create these things, we're trying to make them better. So we've got some skills, we need to probably invest and improve the skills and the education, but we're not creating the thing from scratch. I think that's the big advantage.
Yeah, and I think also it's close to jobs. You know, we want to see jobs for our residents of all kinds, of all sort of skills. And I know in the 1980s, maybe into the 90s as well, in Manchester, we closed schools because we were suffering depopulation. And obviously those areas still got the houses, but they don't have the schools. But obviously as the population has changed over the last 20, 30 years, we've had to look at how we get new schools into those communities, you know, the transport links, as Sandy references. So yeah, there's lots of positives from building on brownfield land that really invests back in our communities, close to jobs, close to transport, close to education. It just costs a lot sometimes to bring those land and those sites back into use. But also residents have probably been going past those sites for 20, 30 years, seeing it derelict. It's a blight on the area. But also those sites can be brought back into really good use. Not just housing, you know, public realm, green spaces in the heart of communities is what we want to see.
And it really does lift up community spirit when you've walked by this derelict site and it finally becomes something. And it just gives you a sense of pride and place.
Yeah, definitely. Very much so. And people have got a lot of pride in where they live, all across Manchester. So we need to, you know, match the aspiration with our plans.
And I think you could say that across areas in the northwest where it was in Preston on Friday looking at a redevelopment site, where by us taking that land on, working with the local community and the council, it will fundamentally transform. But what it will also do is we've got used to placing residential development on the edge of our cities and towns. Actually, to keep and sustain our town centres and city centres, we need to bring that back, we need to bring the community back into the city centre, because it will create activity, it will create jobs. But if we keep on pushing it out, we create our own problems. We core out the centre of our towns and cities.
Well, we do have to talk about the big problem with brownfield and also with retrofit. As wonderful as it is and the great potential and offerings it can bring, it's expensive. So how do we tackle that viability issue? Is it a matter of getting more national government funding to support it? I mean, how do we solve this? Who wants to start us off?
I'll start with a national pick. Yes, we do. We need to recognise regeneration, and I think we are now, after 13 years, recognising the advantage of regeneration and sustained funding and long-term intervention to achieve those goals we've talked about. I've seen over the last year with Homes England strategy changing and with some of the announcements the government's coming, we finally recognised it again, but we need to keep that going. So the viability challenge will partly be addressed by that funding and by the ambition of local councils like Manchester and the ones that we work with like Preston and Liverpool. But it will also be addressed by creating a market. If you and housing associations are well placed to do this, if I look back my own time starting in housing in Glasgow, it was housing associations' intervention to start and create the market that will then bring the private sector in behind. So you need to be prepared to do that. And once you've done it, the private sector will see the opportunity, because they won't invest unless they see the value. But if you create the value, they will invest, is my general experience of this.
Yeah, I agree, Sandy. And I think one of the other things is that we obviously do want to see brownfield land funding. We've started to see a bit more of that, and we'd always welcome more. But also looking at things like VAT and tax and incentives. So on retrofit, if you install an air source heat pump, there's no VAT on it. If you do a whole house retrofit, it's 20%. So it kind of disincentivizes from retrofitting whole houses because you have to pay the VAT. So I think government could do some quite simple things which would really unlock a lot of investment into retrofit. I think the same could be done on certain landfill and brownfield land development, you know, where there is sort of tax incentives for private developers to invest alongside brownfield funding, alongside local authorities. So, yeah, there's a big ask from us locally for government there.
And I think some of the things that have been done in the past, like guarantees, the government or a government agency acting as a guarantor sometimes can be enough. We've regenerated and been involved in the renewal of Hattersley for the last 20 years, and what actually allowed that to happen was the underwriting of the land value and the property development values by what is now Homes England. It doesn't have to sometimes be funding, it just can be enough to give the private sector the confidence to make the investment.
Our next key aspect was looking at affordability and how do we make the homes of the future ones that everyone can achieve and actually live in. So can we just talk a little bit more about the need and the demand for affordable homes? Sandy, obviously coming from a housing association, I feel like you're going to be well versed in this one.
Demand. We can let every single property we've got. We've got 35,000 homes. I think you would ask most housing associations in the Northwest, they'll tell you the same. There is massive demand for affordable housing, particularly social and affordable rented properties and shared ownership. We have a growing population. We have a population that is more diverse than it's been in the past. Different family formations all the way through to a growing, valuable older person sector. So we, as a country, unfortunately, haven't built enough social housing, and I think we've also got quite poor quality housing in comparison with the rest of Europe. So there is a real challenge and drive to build lots of social housing in this country, either through councils doing it or housing associations delivering most of it. The volume and scale is probably lower at the moment. We produce less than we need. So I think for the next 10 years, we would like to see an uplift in the volume. And again, I think there's a genuine consensus forming, I think, within the political sphere in terms of the Conservative Party and the Labour Party seeing the value in doing this. So if you have a home that is affordable for you to live in and it's good quality, it's one of the bedrocks both of your health, but it's also of your opportunity as a member of the community.
Yeah, it's vital, isn't it, that I think we've just got an undersupply of homes across all tenures of all types, and we see that most acutely in social and affordable rent, as Sandy describes. And we've got 15,000 people on our housing register in Manchester, and huge need for more housing, more social and affordable housing, but a supply of new housing across the board, because there is a real challenge in private rented sector, in home ownership as well. So our housing strategy really sets out an ambition to build the homes that our residents need at every single level, and to ensure that we can tackle that. There is real high demand in Manchester. People want to live here, which is good, because historically that hasn't always been the case. But there is now a rising population, and our housing strategy has to meet that. And we'd love the government to partner with us on some of those affordable aspects about the grant regime. We're starting to see them move in the right direction in recent years, but we'd always like to see more, to see that delivered on the ground here in Manchester.
And looking more into affordable homes, I mean, Gavin, you mentioned a little bit some different tenures. Is the answer going to be just one particular one? Should it all be rent to buy, or does it, Manchester has a new social rent, for example, which is a different kind of tenure and a different rental rate. Is there one tenure to take them all?
I think we need to build mixed tenure communities. We know that from experience they are more sustainable in the longer term. You get a genuine sense of community. If you design the housing on the basis of it's tenure blind, you deliver a choice. You build probably more social housing, because at the moment affordable rent can be unaffordable to a lot of our customers. So more social housing tenure. Continue with some affordable rent. Rent to buy does work because we know there's a market for it, and shared ownership is also quite successful in particularly providing housing for key workers or people who it's a first home. So I don't think there's one answer to that, but I think it's making sure that we are clear about probably a slight more emphasis more on social housing, I would suggest.
Yeah, I would agree on that. I think we do need mixed tenure, and there's a number of affordable types: social rent, affordable rent, rent to buy, and shared ownership. And yeah, that mixed tenure, but we do have a real lack of that social and affordable rent. And as you referenced, Julia, we have in Manchester now what's called the Manchester Living Rent, which is affordable rent capped at local housing allowance levels, which means it's truly affordable for those on lower incomes, on benefits. And some of the challenges of that is the local housing allowance has been frozen since 2020. So we really need the government to step up on that, because that would help with affordability for housing if the local housing allowance was unfrozen. But yeah, we on our developments through planning, we really seek to secure a mix of affordable and market tenures to really get that mixed tenure communities, which is what a lot of residents really want. But there is a real need for that social and affordable rent.
And just kind of thinking of these mixed tenure communities, I know one of the ways we see affordable housing delivered is when a developer puts in a planning application, they have to provide for a certain amount of on-site affordable housing. Is that the way we should be moving forward, or would it be better if they just contributed and gave money to someone like Sandy to kind of take forward with his work? What do you think, Gavin? I'm just going to keep you on the spot.
I'm open to both. I think we'd like to see more on site, if I'm honest. I think developers delivering that, because then that brings that mixed tenure. But we secure Section 106 funding for affordable housing for off-site, which then works with partners like Onward and other registered providers to deliver that. But I think we'd like to see a bit more on site, if I'm honest, because I think that would seek to bring a bit more affordability into developments in key locations such as the city centre. That's kind of our sort of strategy in Manchester. Trying to secure that through viability processes can be challenging, that I'd like to see more on site.
Nicely handled, well done. So as much as it is great to say that we want affordable homes, once again, just like with the net zero ambitions, they are expensive to build. Is it just money that's keeping us from delivering affordable homes, or is there something else that's holding us back?
I think you would go back to land supply. I think, yes, money is a challenge, and particularly at the moment with borrowing costs, but I think we can manage that if we have confidence in our funding. Now, to be fair to Stroke Homes England, they have been very good over the last couple of years at giving us secured funding streams. Plus, they've also encouraged us by renegotiating, given the current economic circumstances. I think it's land supply. It will always come back to having that relationship with your local authority, the strategic planning authority, to identify those sites at scale that we can build on in the right locations with the right type of housing and the right level of quality. What we want to get out of this is both volume of new affordable housing of all tenures, but value as well. So we don't fall into the trap we might have fallen in the past of building quickly and not building that well. We need to keep our feet to the fire in terms of doing both. So I think land supply is one. Second is capacity within the construction sector. We always talk about it as an issue since I started nearly 30 years ago, which worries me that we haven't solved that. I think what we've been slow to do is pick up new building techniques. I think there's an opportunity to address that by changing the way we build, probably using things like timber frame or panelised wall systems, which are built in a factory. I don't mean volumetric housing, which comes out as a house that's completed, because it just doesn't work in this country. In my view, it certainly doesn't work in the Northwest with the values we've got for affordable housing. But I think we need to be ambitious and then push the envelope on technology. And the way we build at the same time is matching that with land supply so that we get volume and value.
Yeah, I think there's certainly a lot more we can do on modern methods of construction, as Sandy talked about, which will help with the viability and affordability. Land supply is always a challenge, and we want to bring forward as a council the land that we own for housing, and I think other local authorities are moving in that direction and should be, because that's a really vital part of getting the affordable housing in the right locations. I think the government has got to look at the National Planning Policy Framework, which looks at viability, developers' contribution to affordable housing, developers' profits. So I think there's a bit of a debate around what's the right level of profit before a developer has to contribute to affordable housing to get the right mix of housing that our residents need. So I think there's certainly something that we're campaigning on that basis to unlock more funding. But as Sandy said, developers and investors want a supply. They want a long-term surety, and I think we see a real demand to live in this city, live in this region. So there is that demand for housing. So it's bringing forward those different ingredients to bring forward the right tenure of housing and the right supply.
My other thought is seeing housing as part of the infrastructure of the country and how it grows its economy. That if we see that, we know that the periods as a country we've invested heavily in infrastructure, and housing is the time that we've had best economic growth and return. I think that, using it as one of the levers for driving economic growth in the Northwest, which I keep on being reminded coming from south to the north from Scotland, is that the north of England is one of the biggest economies in Europe. Yeah. But sometimes we don't unleash its potential as much as we could.
And I think, as we've talked about earlier on this podcast, about the link between housing and health is vital, isn't it? So decent quality, affordable housing really increases people's health, life expectancy, reduces impact on the NHS. So there's sort of a public benefit. Housing is the fundamental core of people's health and well-being and education and skills and jobs. So if we can get that right, there's also, I think, a spend to save model for other parts of the public sector. So it's having that sort of joined up approach to investment in our nation. And I think housing has to be a key part of that.
Our third ambition is all about social value. After all, we're building places, not just spaces. So, when it comes to being a socially conscious and good developer, there's a certain kind of factor of making sure that there is some rules and policies in place to keep them being good. So what is the MCC doing specifically, Gavin, to help ensure that developers and landlords are acting with the community's best interest at heart?
Yeah, well, as we've talked about on affordability, we require developers to deliver 20% affordable housing on each development. On private sector landlords, we have selective licensing. We've got the Good Landlord Charter coming forward with GMCA. So there's a number of things to hold landlords and developers to account on that. And where we've done selective licensing in Manchester, we have seen some really good outcomes for residents, improvement in the quality of housing, and residents knowing their rights as well, so they can expect, the gas safety to be done, the electric safety, damp and mold to be tackled, fly tipping, those kind of things. So yeah, we want to sort of intervene where it's appropriate in the market to try and regulise that, to get better housing standards for residents. 40% of our residents live in the private rented sector, and that's a lot of people, and sometimes there are rogue landlords that need tackling, so we're working on that with GMCA across the GM region to tackle that. But on social value directly, with our own contracts, we really sort of build that in, that contractors and developers have to have a certain percentage for environmental improvements, for apprenticeships, for local jobs, for investing back in those communities. So as you say, it's not just homes, we want to create places and great communities and neighbourhoods.
Sandy, coming at this, as a developer, how do you feel like would be best to kind of make sure that everyone is acting in the community's best interest?
I think that some of that tone is set by the councils, as Gavin said. It's about the councils and all the public authorities who deal with developers being clear about expectation. So we are there to create places that people can live in the longer term. So we are there to make sure the quality is right. We've got the tenure mix right. We've designed it properly. I think the other thing is seeing social value as the other part, the bigger part potentially of the equation, that when we go in and do major development within towns and cities across the northwest, it's the social value part that we think of in terms of skills and employment training, supporting and enhancing community groups and building that infrastructure that they have. Something we are always very conscious about. Training people, making sure that we've linked to the education, the further education colleges. And actually, one of the things is not just through the procurement process, which we do, because we have it's part of our procurement strategy to do that, as vast majority of housing associations do. But it's that follow through in terms of actually demanding social value delivery by our supply chain partners, because it actually benefits the whole of the economy in the northwest, but our communities in particular, because it makes them sustainable. They actually, if you do enough with them, they will actually sustain themselves. I think I remember being told off by a couple of our residents in Hattersley in terms of we're not regenerated. You're renewing us, and we've done this as a community. You've helped us, but we've done this, and I think that's always a lesson to remember in this.
Yeah, no, I think you have to be in it for the long run, don't you, with regeneration, and sometimes it can take time. But yeah, working alongside communities, making sure that you're not doing stuff to them, but doing stuff with them, that they have a voice, that they have a value, and that they're involved in steering groups and coordinating. And I think, councils and housing associations have got a lot of experience at that, and we're ready to deliver more of that kind of regeneration, renewal, revitalising of communities. And that's really needed, in terms of existing stock and new stock, and ensuring that when new people move into those areas, that they're welcomed, that they're integrated in part to those communities. So yeah, it's quite delicate, quite nuanced sometimes, but making sure that we're right at the heart of that process and ensuring people's voices are heard.
One other thing I would add is it's important that we're including the whole of the community, so that we have a very diverse, which is great, community in the northwest. It's making sure that those parts of the community don't feel excluded. They feel that we're actually consciously thinking about them in terms of what we're going to do and what we plan to do, and that they're not, by the way the approach we adopt, don't feel that they're shoved out. Actually, we're bringing them in.
Well, that is actually all the time we have for today, but thank you guys so much for joining. We've covered a lot of topics here. So if we're going to become I'm just going to summarize briefly. Let me know if this is right. But if we're going to become a community that is what we truly want, we want one that's affordable, it's sustainable, it's inclusive, it's diverse, we definitely need to be serious about retrofit, and we need to be serious about building on brownfield land. It also sounds like to me that we can't tippy-toe around affordability, that we get serious and we make sure we deliver it. And we deliver it in such a way that is kind of accounting for those different mixed tenures, that is making sure we're building in areas where people want to live, and that we're being ambitious and playing around with different methods of construction to kind of help us reach both those affordable and net zero goals. And finally, we're going to make inclusive spaces that really embrace communities. Again, it's places, not spaces. And in order to do that, we're going to, one, hold people to account for the actions they do, but we're also going to make sure that we engage from the community right from the get-go. And we want to make sure that this is something that doesn't happen to them, but happens with them. So was that a pretty good summary, Sandy, Gavin?
Yeah, that's a good
Fantastic
summary,
Julia.
Thank you,
Well
guys.
done.
It's
In a
like I do
snapshot.
this for a living. Well, thank you guys so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you very much for your
It's
time.
been great to be here. Thank you.
And if you'd like to know more about the built environment in the Northwest, be sure to subscribe to placenorthwest.co.uk. And if you want to know more about Onward Homes, go to onward.co.uk.